Water Quality Management Committee meeting Wednesday, February 7th, 2018 will come to order. We are joined by Selectman Doug Brown, our frequent flyer from the Planning Board, Paul, our legal from the League of Women Voters, Miriam Cronin, and the Falmouth Enterprise. We have two major presentations today and some smaller business, so I just want to give a sort of a brief overview for our nationwide TV audiences to give some context to all this. Our job, of course, since the committee was created, was to look at alternatives to sewering and to look at sewering in instances where it was the most cost-effective and environmentally effective way to address nitrogen problems in the estuaries. As we're all getting more and more immersed in the details of this, I think we're all coming to the realization that the critical element is not necessarily the treatment plant or the pipes or anything else. It's what you do with the treated wastewater after you've treated it. In Falmouth, up till now, the town has treated the wastewater down to 3 milligrams per liter and discharged it into, so far, one location, which is right next to the treatment plant. When Maravista and the Heights go online, they'll be discharging it into an additional new discharge site just north of the treatment plant. But at that point, the capacity of the town to take any more treated sewage is zero, unless an additional or more than one additional site is found for discharging treated wastewater. So that's what this committee is going to spend today and days to come on. Before we get into the presentations for the new options, I want to give the town a little jog of their memory as to what previous options had been looked at for future discharge of additional wastewater. One is the town purchased some years ago a 20-acre piece between Brickhelm Road and Route 28 next to the Falmouth lumber yard. It's called the Augusta parcel because the Augusta family owned it. It was purchased partly with land bank money and partly with town funds, and the premise was that it would be usable as a discharge site or a pump station or some, whatever future sewering in the Aquifer Peninsula would require, this site would be available for that purpose. There's another site further out. I think this one is 5 miles from the treatment plant. It's up near the Hayway. Where are we here?
Sandwich Road, Hayway Road.
Hayway Road.
Carriage Shop Road.
It was called the Allen parcel. Mildred Allen sold it to the town for a good price. It was part of a larger parcel the town bought, but 14 acres of the parcel was designated for municipal use. The rest is for conservation. So it is theoretically available for this municipal use. Third one is the Falmouth Country Club, which once again is bought with a combination of land bank money, community preservation money, town money, partly for the recreation, but also the premise was that it may provide a site for some kind of discharge of treated wastewater. Again, this one is 6 miles from the treatment plant. There are others that have been looked at. Those are the three that have gotten the most attention and the most study. And we're here today to talk about 2 other discharge sites that have not gotten much scrutiny from the town at this point because they are not in the town. The first one is the Joint Base Cape Cod. We have with us, we're very lucky to have Ed Leonard. He's the reason we changed the date, because when Ed could come is when we were going to meet. He's been doing a study for the 4 Upper Cape towns funded by the state of Massachusetts to look at the facilities there, to look at what use they would be to the 4 towns, and to look at what it would cost, how it would be managed, and what the prospects of it in real time are. So, Ed,
Okay.
You have the floor.
Do you want me to go up there for the microphone?
That would be fine if someone else can
Yeah.
run this clicker in.
I got
Even
it.
if the other thing is, if you prefer sitting, we could move this for you.
Doesn't matter to me, I'll do whatever you guys
Which
want.
one?
Whatever's good for you.
Well, let's do this then, because it's easier to see everybody from here. All right, well, I appreciate you having me here tonight. I've been in front of this group before in the past, or different constitution of the groups a couple years ago. But as Eric said, this project was funded by a Commonwealth Efficiency and Regionalization Grant. Falmouth was the fiscal agent on behalf of Bourne, Falmouth, Mashpee, Sandwich, and Joint Base Cape Cod. The project started in June of last year, so it was June 2017, and we finished it in November 2017. So it was a very fast-paced project to try and accomplish a lot of information. So the presentation overview, I'm going to give you a little background on Joint Base Cape Cod itself, talk about the big picture of the project that we undertook, and kind of walk you through the analysis process, what the alternatives were, because some of them will sound familiar to folks that have been involved in Falmouth wastewater planning for some time, because Ray Jack was the point of contact, and there were similar alternatives evaluated. I'll let you know what the next steps are, and then we can do whatever you want for questions. I got about 30 slides, so I'm shooting for 30 minutes, and then whatever you want for questions. So, Joint Base Cape Cod's about 22,000 acres, and it's bounded by the purple area on the figure here. Of that, about 75% is called the Northern Training Area, which is basically an environmental designation. So you, without an act of the legislature, it's really challenging to do anything in those, whatever that is, 16,000 acres. The base itself was built prior to World War II for 70,000 troops. So it has a pretty extensive collection system, 36 miles of sewer, 11 pump stations. Things are really spread out on the base. The original treatment facility built in the 40s was a 3 million gallon per day treatment facility. In 1991, that was replaced with a 0.3 MGD wastewater treatment facility. That facility was then upgraded when the Barnstable County Jail was constructed. So the current capacity of the treatment facility is 0.36, so 360,000 gallons per day. There's an 11-mile force main. So the treatment facility is located in Sandwich, actually. And the force main is at 11 miles, runs through the cantonment, which is the developed portion of the base, through the Northern Reserve, into Bourne, and way up to about halfway down the canal. So it's on the base, southeast of Service Road. There's no abutters between the rapid infiltration basin site and the canal itself. As I said, those are in Bourne, and those have a 360,000 gallon per day capacity as well. And those numbers are all annual average basis. So the current flows are about 140,000 gallons per day, which means there's only about 220,000 gallons per day of capacity. And each of the towns is looking for more than that in terms of capacity. So the goals of that project were to identify costs for a shared wastewater approach, and then to confirm whether or not each of the towns individually had interest in continuing to pursue that as an approach. Given that there's limited excess capacity, that each municipality has a different set of needs, whether it's sewage, septage, or effluent disposal. The facility itself is, the sewers are 70 years old, the treatment facility is 25 years old, so there's baseline improvements that need to be made just to keep it running and reliable. One of the advantages is the effluent disposal system is outside a nitrogen-sensitive watershed. The canal south watershed has at least been, so far, DEP has determined that it's not sensitive. And certainly there's significant economies of scale available at the base with such a large footprint, no real abutters in terms of private citizens anyway. So the biggest issue here is how is the cost associated with getting to the location is the biggest differentiator among the towns, and then what we do with it there is sort of the basis of the study. So we had a working group that was established. 2 folks from Falmouth participated, Ray Jack and Amy Lowell. Each of the other towns, Julian Suso. So each town also had their town manager involved. So Julian was involved for Falmouth. We also had a representative from Joint Base Cape Cod, who was the individual that ran the facilities when he was stationed at the base, as well as some involvement from Mass Development along the way. We did invite DEP to attend one of the meetings and the commission. They read a pre-draft of the report, so they've chimed in on this as well. So the first big task was to figure out who needs what. So we broke things down into the following categories: sewage, septage, effluent, and then leachate effluent. And the different communities had different needs there. In terms of Falmouth, so I'm going to try and keep this sort of Falmouth focused. Falmouth's request, and then we also broke it down into short-term, mid-term, long-term. We identified what the study basis was, which is the middle column, and then we looked at a low end and a high end in order to bracket a conceptual low and high end to see if the study basis was cost effective and people are interested, that they might say, oh, we actually would like more. So you'll see here that there's a pretty broad range in numbers from Falmouth. The study basis was essentially taking the wastewater, as Eric said, the capacity limitation. So you have a facility that can take 1.2 million gallons per day, but you can only dispose of about 710. So the 490 number is the rest of that capacity going to Joint Base as effluent. And then in the long term, what Amy and I had discussed was adding 1 million gallons per day of need. And in this case, Blacksmith Shop Road would be upgraded to expand to that extra million gallons of capacity, and that extra 1 million gallons would also go to Joint Base. The bracketed conditions were less sewer need, less flow to the base, and then on the high end it was someday maybe Blacksmith Shop Road gets abandoned and all sewage is sent to an even larger facility at Joint Base. So those were, both ends were really pie in the sky, and what we're looking at is the study basis. So the numbers you'll see moving forward are all study basis column. So when we added up what everybody was looking for, the existing condition is, as I had mentioned earlier, about this is capacity. In the short term, there wasn't a lot of need. Bourne was looking to construct a treatment facility to collect leachate from the landfill, treat it, and send it to the effluent beds. That's most of what the short-term need was. In the midterm, communities started having more sewer growth or additional effluent from Bourne, some effluent from Falmouth, and you can see those increase. As you get to the longer term, the numbers are quite large, so their effluent disposal is an order of magnitude higher. So we're looking at about a 4-fold increase in treatment capacity. So the lightest color is treatment, and the darkest is effluent, and about a 10-fold increase in effluent disposal. Oops. All right, so when you added up all those pieces, the treatment was about 1.2 million gallons per day. Transport to disposal, we get the 11 miles we have to get between treatment and disposal is a significant factor here. And then we have disposal at the 3.3 million gallons per day. We didn't touch collection at all because we assumed that each town would be on their own. Some towns have existing collection systems like Falmouth, others don't. And then conveyance we did include because it was a significant cost, and we said in Falmouth's case, from the Blacksmith Shop Road treatment plant, there was a cost for that pump station, and the pipe to get from there to wherever we connected it in the system. So we did that for each community, and this is a little tough to see on this, but you can see in the lower left corner, this is Blacksmith Shop Road. We looked at a couple of alternatives to get from there to Joint Base. We ended up selecting Route 28 to Route 151 to Turpentine Road and connecting. So in that scenario, Falmouth was looking at treated effluent, so we connected to the effluent pipe and ran that the rest of the way. The other towns had pump stations, obviously, in their town with their own force mains. In some cases, they were pumping sewage, and other cases, it was effluent.
Does the existing effluent pipe going through the base have the capacity to take the Falmouth load?
Well, sorry, finish your question.
So in other words, would we have to replace that effluent pipe all the way from the base treatment plant to the discharge site?
Right. So the existing pipe is a 12-inch diameter pipe, and it's sized for basically the 360,000 gallons per day and on an annual average basis. So in the alternatives we looked at, we ultimately had 3 pipes that were going that distance from a cost perspective. We had the existing pipe plus 1 new pipe at midterm and another new pipe at long term. So, and we can get into this in Q&A, but when you phase projects, it gives you the opportunity to spend less money in the early years, but you may or may not spend a little bit extra in the later years in order to afford the ability to phase it. So the assumption we made was short term, the existing pipe was sufficient. In the midterm, we added 1 pipe, and in the long term, we added a 2nd pipe. So again, as Eric mentioned at the beginning, effluent disposal is really the rub here. The type of disposal dictates the location, and we looked at rapid infiltration basins. We looked at wicks, which is essentially a gravel well that you put water in at atmospheric pressure, and it drains into the aquifer. Deep well injection, which is basically a pressurized wick. You pump it under pressure into the aquifer, and then an outfall. And we were looking at an outfall to the canal, since once you get over there, you're really close to the canal. Deep well injection was the only one that could have had a short travel distance because of the nature of the method and where the effluent would go once it was in the aquifer. So rapid infiltration, basins, wicks, and outfall all had a long travel distance. Deep well injection had a short travel distance. And then the type of disposal dictated the treatment requirements of the facility itself. So we looked at what we expected a permit to be for each of the major criteria. This rapid infiltration basin column should be pretty close to what most RIB permits are. Falmouth has a fairly stringent RIB permit. As you look at deep well, the ones that are shaded in the yellowish color are the things that are either very different, a little different, or very different from what we'd call conventional on the Cape. So deep well injection is is quite stringent, and requires much more significant treatment. So in terms of disposal, we have a lot of overlaying factors at this site. These are, again, really busy figures on the wall here, but everything that's hatched is a zone 2. And then these funny shaped red outlines are plumes from historic activities at the base. The yellow shading is the northern training area. And anything that's white are the little slivers that might be appropriate for disposal. So there's not actually a lot. And then if you consider what's nitrogen sensitive, it's sort of a different overlay. So it gets complicated pretty quick, but what we narrowed it down to is that the rapid infiltration basins or wicks at the current site, canal outfall adjacent to the current site, and then deep well injection alternatives near the cemetery and then in the cantonment area. We looked at 6 different alternatives with different levels of treatment and different lengths of force mains. And when you tallied all that stuff up, so it includes, it does not include collection, but it includes conveyance, treatment, transport to disposal, and disposal. All that stuff adds up to $140 to $170 million for those 6 alternatives. And that would need to be allocated to the different towns somehow, but that's the total cost. We did calculate an annual operation and maintenance cost and a debt service to estimate an equivalent annual cost. And again, that 10.7 million to 16.9 is for the 6 alternatives for everybody who's in, based on the study basis flows. The chart here shows things on a normalized basis. So the lowest cost was option 1, which was expand the rapid infiltration basins. All the other columns are that option divided by option 1, just to kind of keep it simple. And what you'll see here is options 1, 2, 4, and 6 are all reasonably close. They're really all within 3, 4, 5% of each other. And those are either RIBs with wicks, RIBs with a canal outfall, or just a canal outfall. So what we recommended was, let's consider those 4 as equivalent. At this planning level analysis, it's 5%. It's basically the same number. Deep well injection has a number of hurdles, and there's some significant costs associated with doing that. The costs are driven by the regulations. The regulations are written to disincent that activity, which may or may not be something that will be disincentivized in the long term as you look at sustainability of a sole source aquifer. So in the costing that we put together, we looked at where the wells are in the aquifer, elevation-wise. So you have a mound of water, and the wells pull off the top 100 feet. So we were looking at injecting well below that. There's still several hundred feet, 100, 200 feet of aquifer below where the wells pull from. So there is a discussion that that will probably need to play out over the long term, but in the short term, that's the kind of cost differential that deep well injection has, and that's 2.5 times to 3 times the conventional options.
Do you want questions as we go along?
Go ahead, yeah.
Is there any advantage to the deep well?
So the advantages would be less travel, less pipe, less pump distance. The advantage would be that you'd be replenishing the aquifer from the bottom and not necessarily where you're withdrawing the drinking water from, but you're keeping saltwater intrusion at bay by keeping the bubble full-sized. That's the primary advantage of it. And the stringent treatment levels that the regulations currently require are very protective based on, I guess we'd say, based on the science that's available today.
So the question that I always have when Ray discusses this, it requires reverse osmosis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what do you do with the salt part of the state won't let you put that out on outfall. You can't send it to space. So it seems to me
Right.
that takes it off the table before you even start talking about it.
Yeah, it becomes very challenging, and you have to do a lot of, and we had to do a lot of learning about deep well injection on this project as well, because it's not something, for the regulations aren't unique to Massachusetts that are that restrictive, and really it's Florida, California is where they're doing it, and they have a whole different set of hydrogeologic things going on there. So that's a major challenge once you even get past the initial challenge of where to put it and how much to treat it.
So the regs took it off the table, and you did too.
Yeah. But we did flag out that if the regulations could be modified or influenced over time, if it was appropriate and based on science, that's something that, you know, DEP did that with George Zotto's report a number of years ago. What would we change about regulations in order to make nitrogen removal projects happen faster? And some of those things did change, so. But
It's also incredibly expensive to push water through a membrane.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Much
So-
higher pressures,
Energy costs.
right. So,
And it might be better to wait for John's presentation, but anybody want to guess what the chances of getting a permitted ocean outfall for treated wastewater?
Actually, you want to wait for John's
I was
presentation?
gonna say, I think it might be better, but I just,
yep. Yeah, okay.
Keep going.
All right, so we did, as I mentioned, break it down by phase. So the initial short-term phase was about $9 million. The big chunk where most people got heavily engaged in it was close to $100 million, and then in the longer term, it was another $40 million. So that totals, I think, 146 million. So this is where it drifts into management, policy, things that we identified but didn't resolve. But this was one where we did kick it around the working group. We said, we have $146 million, we need to allocate it somehow, because everybody, in order to decide whether they want to participate, need to know what's it going to cost me. So we broke it down as follows. The conveyance was a town-related cost, and each town paid their full share of their own conveyance. The treatment cost was prorated based on the treatment capacity that was needed. The transport to disposal and disposal was prorated based on effluent disposal capacity that was needed. And then contingency, technical services, legal admin, all that stuff that at the studies are typically carried with a 40%, 35 to 50% multiplier. If you look at all your planning reports from other engineers and from ours, you see that. You have a construction estimate and then a factor for the things that we don't know. And so that is prorated based on each community's share of the construction cost. So anyway, those were the rules that we created. Nobody objected. And so when you take the 146 and break it down, this is what it looks like for Falmouth. So Falmouth didn't request capacity in the near term, so the near term was 0. In the midterm, it was 28 million. In the long term, it was just over 10 million. And so I didn't say this in the beginning, but short term was intended to be 0 to 5 years, in recognizing that this has been on the table for 20 years. Bourne has, their pressing need is the landfill leachate. The midterm was intended to be within 20 years. So say 10 to 20 years. And then the long term was 20 years and beyond. So in terms of equivalent annual cost, we looked at what is that capital in terms of debt, what's the share of the O&M. So these are roughly what the equivalent annual cost would be for each community. Falmouth was 2.1 million in the midterm and 1.7 in the long term. We worked with, in our proposal, we had recommended working with the town's designated consultant to sort of sanity check this versus previous planning efforts. So folks thought that was a good idea. Some towns didn't identify anybody. Some towns we were already working with. And Falmouth, Jack had identified GHD. GHD's done a lot of planning work in Falmouth over the years. So what we compared this to was the draft CWMP, where there were substantial costs, but it was a very broad-based, they were similar comparisons in terms of scope and breadth. So we created a metric because it was, as you can imagine, there's already been a lot of numbers in this presentation, so trying to dissect pieces and parts was super challenging. So we said, let's go with just capital cost, per 1,000 gallons of effluent capacity, which is similar to how, never mind. That was the only way we could get these things to be comparable. So from this study, we came up with the cost on that metric was $85 to $104. And then GHD looked at the work that was done previously and came up with 107 to 170. And that was pretty consistent across the board, that this study showed that the economy of scale played a role, and that the distance to convey didn't offset that economy of scale. So that was a reasonably consistent conclusion. And this is a clip out of, which you can't see the red and the black in this light, but this is in Appendix C of the report, GHD. So we had them write a memo comparing things, and it had appropriate caveats in terms of this was a draft report that was done a long time ago, and it's not the current version of what Falmouth is proposing. But it shows that the green is the lowest cost, the yellow are comparable costs, and the red are higher. So the conclusion is, for Falmouth, is based on the information that's on the table now, it's appropriate to continue to consider this as an option. It's not necessarily that it's a slam dunk, but it's appropriate to consider it, continue to consider it. And that was a consistent conclusion for all the other towns. So regionalization provides cost savings. The advantages do appear to outweigh the disadvantages. There's certainly a number of challenges that we'll talk about in a minute here in terms of actually making this viable. There is a number of factors. Each of the effluent disposal methods have their own tripping hazards. None of them are slam dunks. Even the rapid infiltration basins, which are conventional and approvable, there's no place to put them in the footprint that we can't put enough basins on the land that's available. So we would need adjacent land, as one example. So even the things that are conventional and usual are challenging. So we recommended continued evaluation. Falmouth and the other towns did agree. They pursued a grant, and it's a follow-on grant. It's my understanding that that was awarded. I haven't seen any paperwork on that yet, but I think that's a good sign. So then we have things like the management and policy issues that go with this concept. So we have who will run it, the management entity, the issues associated with having multiple different treatment facilities discharged to one disposal facility, who and how determines how much capacity each town gets and how much they pay for it, and then the necessary intermunicipal and intergovernmental agreements, because you have a federal agency in this as well, agencies as well. So right now the base, the military owns this, and they don't really want to anymore. The thought was that we would have an initial management entity take it over. There was some discussion about that perhaps being mass development, that may or may not happen. But in the context of the study, there was an initial and then a successor. We may or may not need to go right to a successor. We looked at a couple of different approaches to that, but really with a multi-town framework, a special purpose district is really, I think, the only way that makes sense. And whether that's a new district or a modification of an existing there's not much distinction there, other than the procedural methods of adding responsibilities to an existing or creating one. We did recommend, obviously, the towns keep their collection, and then the conveyance piece could be owned by either the special purpose district or the towns themselves. But then treatment, transport, and disposal would be by the district, was the recommendation. Multiple permittees, as I said, there's a lot of issues that go into this. You have treatment facilities that may or may not be meeting their own permit on any particular day. It's not unheard of, but it's not common. So this would be a challenge that would need to be worked through with regulators. And then depending on which method, it involves different regulators. So if it's land-based, it's DEP. If it's surface water, it's both DEP and EPA. So again, another challenge. So more discussions need to happen on that. There's any number of ways you could allocate capacity, from who wants to pay the most for the capacity to who's shovel-ready. What's the best environmental benefit? We agreed that there's probably those and more, and we didn't go any further. It's really a discussion that needs to happen with the participants and whoever's running it. And I suspect if you ask different agencies, you'd get a different answer as to which would be preferred from their perspective. We discussed as a working group how to get from here to there, and the consensus was that there should be probably initial intermunicipal agreements to say, we want to continue to plan, we're interested, but stop short of capital, any kind of commitment to capital expenditure other than planning level expenditures. And then once it's confirmed, that there would be subsequent either collective or individual agreements to say, we want this many gallons of capacity and we will pay this many dollars for it. And as you can imagine, if some of the towns said, oh, well, that's cost effective, we want more flow, which changes all the math. So, or nobody has said we might want less flow. So there's a little bit of, I think this will take a number of times through in order to get to something conclusive. I'm not going to try and go through all these. This is a figure in the report.
Thank you.
There's a lot of steps. If I convey one thing, it's feasible but complicated. There's a lot of boxes to check, and this is figure 3.1 in the report. So the next steps were, we were trying to get actual letters of support, and there was some debate about whether or not people ultimately wanted to do that or not, but everybody agreed that it was a good idea to try and pursue another grant. And as I said, I believe that has happened. The last one was the Commonwealth Efficiency and Regionalization Grant. I think it's EEA.
Okay.
And then there's a number of steps for individual towns to take on their own, and lots of discussions. Okay?
We're good at that.
So I have those slides. I have some other ones anticipating questions, so
Okay. Well, we do have questions, and start with Matt.
What did you assume in terms of treatment level for the sewage that would be pumped up to the base?
it varied by alternative. So for the rapid infiltration basins,
Yes, so just I guess for that one.
it was simpler than what you have at your facility now. We had a enhanced nitrogen removal, so we assumed an SBR, sequencing batch reactor like Falmouth has, sized for nitrogen removal to 5 milligrams per liter, but we did not have denitrifying filters because at that location, you shouldn't need it. In your current location, you do.
Right. Yeah.
You mentioned that one obstacle with the rapid infiltration basins was the possibility that there wasn't enough real estate. Is it reasonable to imagine a hybrid approach in which you put your first flow in the available RIBs that you can build, and then put additional flow in some more expensive things, such as, say, the piping it up to the canal, but then you don't have to build as big a pipe because you already got rid of some of it where you were in the RIBs?
Yes, so some of these alternatives, and I didn't try and wade into that initially, but we had hybrid alternatives here where option one, RIBs are pretty intensive footprint-wise, square feet, so that needed more land. Option two was the existing basins plus a lot of wicks on the footprint of that site within the fence line, so it wouldn't require additional land. Option 4 was to keep the existing RIBs and run a pipe the rest of the way to the canal. So we did look at that, and I think that may help in terms of either the alternative that's implemented and/or the phasing of an alternative.
And my second question, if you can go to that slide with the red horizontal bars with the black numbers in them that you can't read.
This one?
No, red horizontal bars.
Red horizontal.
It was out of the GHD.
Oh, that one, yep,
Yes.
Yes.
That one.
yep.
I can read the numbers in the red
Yeah.
bar, and they're higher, as you said.
Yep.
Is that saying that when you're talking about the outfall there, are you saying that the idea of a purely Falmouth outfall is more expensive than these options?
So this,
Or you're
yes,
saying
that's the
canal
conclusion
outfall?
of this table. But this table is based on the evaluation that was done in 2007, based on the locations for outfalls that were looked at that time, with Falmouth
Right.
being the only participant. So,
That's the $40 million for NAPSCO.
right. So there's a whole bunch of caveats that go with that. These were planning assumptions that were in place at that time that may or may not still be applicable, but in terms of the things that were available to look at and compare it to, Falmouth going it alone in that regard would likely be more expensive than participating with others.
Other comments, questions?
The Falmouth mid and upper level wastewater treatment numbers that you got from Ray Jack and Amy, just for scale, I mean, how many watersheds does that, do you know, Thea, how many watersheds equivalent is that amount of wastewater? Is
All
it?
of them.
Okay, so the upper limit would assume that all of them were sewer?
Yeah, I think, in general, it's the 2.2 million gallons per day
Yeah,
is pretty much the old number from sewer.
okay,
Right, it's
Thank you. Yeah.
3 times what we're putting in now.
okay.
Right,
So it's everything. yeah.
right.
And the small number covers what?
The small, I'm trying to get back there.
Yeah,
What was it, 200,000 or 300,000?
Right, the 300,000, I dug out the email to refresh my memory. That was, the words that Amy used was one additional collection area after Little Pond. So she didn't specify which one that would be or whether that has even been specified by anybody yet, but that was why that's the smaller number. And then in terms of the long-term low end, it was essentially, it's the same number as the study basis for the midterm. So that would be, in the future, we don't need more than we thought we wanted at the midterm now.
and I think the 1.2 is actually the plant capacity.
Correct.
Like the plant does right now, 1.2. It doesn't need an upgrade or anything to do that. So that basically says we're discharging midterm what the plant can do. And then the 2.2 is a new plant.
Right, that would be, rather than building a new plant, so this is now 2040.
Yep.
So rather than upgrading the Blacksmith Shop Road plant at that time, you would abandon that facility, build a big pump station and pump it to the joint base. That was just a planning level concept,
Yeah, let's keep
an
that
upper
one on
bound.
paper.
Yeah,
Couple of questions, and I'm looking at your numbers here. Our particular interest, of course, is what we started out talking about, where we're going to put the treated effluent. You've got a page here that talks about pumping it from Falmouth treatment plant to the base site. You've got 3 sets of numbers, 11.6, 12.6, and 11.7, as 3 alternatives for the cost of doing that. And they're all in the same ballpark, so it's fair to say that if we wanted that option, $12 million is the capital cost of creating that pipe to that discharge site.
that is the cost to get, so that's the cost to get to the junction point where we're connecting.
Right.
Where we would need to connect to the effluent force mains that would be added over time as well. So
Okay.
the conveyance piece is to get it basically to the south part of the base.
So that explains why the Falmouth allocation is 28 million, because we pay 12 million to get it to that pipe, but then we have to pay for a new pipe.
portion of the new pipe.
The new pipe that
Correct.
gets it.
Yep.
Okay. So that makes it real expensive.
It does, yeah. And that's, that's the drawback of having an 11-mile force main to get from
Right.
a small treatment plant to a
Right.
well-located disposal location.
Yeah. Anybody looking at the map would say the railroad right-of-way would be the way to go. What are the difficulties in running a pipe along the railroad right-of-way?
It was shorter,
It was shorter.
but working next to a railroad, crossing a railroad is challenging. So working adjacent to a railroad for a long stretch is even more challenging, just in terms of procedural. We just carried a higher unit cost associated with that portion of the run. I mean, I think, again, from a planning level perspective, they're really not fundamentally different alternatives, and the costs aren't dramatically different. So I wouldn't consider any of those three alternatives, forget the other two and do this one. It shows that they're all reasonably consistent, and the one we picked was the most conventional.
And if you use tank cars, that's comical, right?
That would be comical, yeah. Or at least expensive, maybe not comical.
Well, looking at your study, the only interest Falmouth has in anything up there is septic haulers. If we take them now at our own plant, but if we wanted to send them up there, there'd be capacity for that. And this $12 million or $28 million pipe to take the treated effluent from the plant and get it up there. It's an expensive option,
It is, yeah.
extremely. I'm very interested in the wick. We sort of understand these others because we've experienced them and we've seen them. But the wick option, you said, had been installed in the vineyard.
Yep.
And what
Yep.
are the pros and the cons of that?
There's a handful of them. There's not a lot in the state, but there are a handful. So it's, so this is a depiction of a wick. So it's you would have a casing a certain distance down, and it, depending on how big it might, you would drill it, fill it with gravel, and then you have to have the ability to purge it and disinfect it, because you'll get some biological growth on that stone that's in there, but effectively it's creating a pathway through any semi-confining layers to get it to open up a surface area that's vertical as opposed to purely horizontal.
So it's like a leaching field, except it goes straight down.
Yeah.
Like our old leaching pits.
Yeah.
Right.
So West Island has had those for a number of years.
What's
off
that?
of West Island
Yep.
off of
Yeah.
Yep.
Fairhaven. And they had initial problems
They
with
did.
it, I believe.
Yep.
Well,
And
what is the downside and what happens
the
when you?
downside is, imagine trying to maintain, so if you had to maintain your leach field that was drilled vertically into the ground, and you only have access to whatever, 72 square feet of it.
And there's some concern with the accumulation of
Yep.
chlorinated compounds at depth too,
Yep.
right? If that's what
Yeah,
you're gonna clean it
you
with.
wouldn't
Yeah.
apply chlorine to it routinely. You would do it just like you would do a
A
potable
purge.
well.
Yeah.
You've got to shock them sometimes to clean them out.
And the casing material on the wick?
Uh,
It's only porous at depth, right?
Correct, yeah. In the upper part, you would have a precast concrete access around it, but then a steel casing
Steel.
or stainless steel, depending on what you wanted.
And how far down does it go?
It depends on the hydrogeology. I mean, you need to get through confining layers. A wick is an atmospheric discharge, so you're discharging in the unsaturated zone at no pressure. So, sorry, it's atmospheric, it's not pressurized, and it's in the unsaturated zone. So if it's a discharging above groundwater. So in this case, you got 70, 80, 90 feet depth to groundwater. So these might be 50, 60 feet deep, depending on the geology.
What kind of volume do they take?
Smaller ones might be, I think what we assumed in this was 100,000 gallons per day each, so there'd be quite a fleet of them.
Well, the figure of merit would be the gallons per acre, using these versus RIBs in the same acre.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't, I don't think we figured it that way in this, but if you were trying to compare the two, you'd resolve it to acres. In
Right.
this case, it's a gallons per day per thing per wick, so we said, okay, if we get this much capacity per wick, we need this many of them. Could we fit those on the parcel?
And didn't you have a chart that showed the requirements for the water going into them
Yes.
is more stringent than that going into RID?
Correct. And so the issue that happened on West Island is they got fouled by effluent from the treatment facility. So if you have a process upset, which does happen at treatment facilities, and the effluent isn't always per permit, if it ends up in the wick, you have a challenge in order to try and flush that stuff out. So we added an extra treatment step in this cost of sand filtration at the treatment facility site, so that you had a sand filtration prior to disposal in the wick.
So you're collecting all the effluent at the bottom of your sand filtration?
Right, a sand filter, I mean, it's not unlike your D-night filter that's at your plant. You have it's a barrier to solids.
Do you know how it's worked out in the vineyard? Has it been there long enough to know?
It works great on the vineyard because the reason it was installed there was they had semi-confining layers in their geology, and they were able to get through it and below it to something that was much more permeable, so it didn't create a mound. And now that they have more of them and they understand what happens when they get fouled and they rotate them,
Yeah.
they've been operating successfully.
The reason we're intrigued, I think, is if there were going to be land-based solutions to this, your traditional lagoon, so to speak, would not be popular with any neighbors, whereas these things would not be seen by the neighbors, and the land could actually be used for something besides this. Is there anything that pops up above the surface that would prevent the land from being used?
Well, the one in the vineyard's actually in a playground.
Okay, well, that was my question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
in Tisbury.
it's a little tough to see in this picture, but this one has,
Road trip.
Yep.
they often,
Yes, oh, yes. Yeah, okay, good.
they often have like a precast structure around it that wouldn't look all that different from a manhole.
But you could put it flush with the
You
ground.
could put it flush, you put a hatch on it, you would have, you need enough room to work in there, so maybe that stuff's a little bit lower. There are several wicks at, I don't remember the name of the golf course in Hingham, one of the higher end golf courses in Hingham, and it's in the woods between fairways.
Right.
And,
Hingham, Tisbury, West Island, and Orleans, maybe.
Orleans maybe, yeah.
So, okay, well, that's good to know. Any other comments or questions?
One from the audience.
Sam, Selectman, join us. Yeah, come to a microphone and,
The question of degrading the amount of recharge that, most of our effluent disposal methods allows. It looks like the WIC system might actually allow a certain amount of recharge to our aquifer to, keep the salt water out and keep wells that we might use to augment our freshwater system still working without them being contaminated with salt water. Am I misinterpreting that, or is that a way of mitigating the issue of not adequate recharge for the amount of effluent that you're disposing outside of your aquifer?
The wick itself is, because it's not pressurized and because it's in the unsaturated zone, it basically lands on top of the aquifer. It's not discharged deep in the aquifer. So the plumes tend to ride on the surface of the aquifer for a while, and then they go down as they travel away. A wick, I wouldn't consider it as a recharge of groundwater per se. I mean, it's recharge of groundwater like a rapid infiltration basin is. It's just a different footprint configuration. If you're within a certain distance of a well or within a zone 2, there are more stringent treatment requirements. So you could put them in those locations. You'd just have to remove total organic carbon, just like you would with deep well injection at some point.
Thank you.
thank you.
Just a question on the guess, ongoing costs? The comparison you did was capital costs, so it's going to be more than $46 million for Falmouth's portion of getting from our wastewater treatment facility to the discharge on the base. When you did that comparison, where did that, and I know I saw it, and I just wanted to highlight it. Can you talk a little bit about the ongoing O&M costs that Falmouth would also be?
$440,000.
Yeah. That was in, right, that's the midterm. So that,
Throw the slide up there.
yeah, it didn't actually have
It
that
wasn't on the slide.
number as a slide.
I was looking at the report and I thought, I didn't remember it in the slides, but
Right, so the annual O&M is embedded in the equivalent annual cost.
yeah, but that's not the thing that you
Right.
did the.
Yep,
So
I'm getting-
that dollar for dollar per 1,000 gallon comparison doesn't include
Correct.
ongoing operation and maintenance.
correct.
And what we've seen in other cases like IA systems, that's pretty
Yeah.
significant.
Yep. In terms of the alternatives that we're looking at, and so that's back to this. This chart shows annual O&M is green. So there's a little bit of difference. The WIC is maybe 8% more than the RIB.
Yeah, that's no sorry.
Outfall is maybe 10, just under 10% more. Those are in the same ballpark in terms of, we just tried to minimize the complexity of that analysis because it was getting,
And the deep well injection is just a lot more expensive.
right.
And what was the annual, was it 40,000?
440.
440.
That was Falmouth's share in the midterm.
So that would be in addition to the cost of the
Capital.
capital.
Right.
Almost $500,000 annually.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right, because it's probably, I forget the numbers, how far Falmouth is to the junction, but Falmouth would be pumping more than 11 miles to get to that location. So it's not insignificant
Right. A good bit uphill. too.
cost. Yeah, right, it's,
And right.
Undulating.
Include electricity.
Yeah.
right.
Yes, if Ron were here, he'd be pointing that out. So, any other comments or questions? Listen, we really appreciate you coming, because
Yeah.
this is our next door neighbor, and it's good to know what's going on up there, and that Falmouth's a part of it.
Yeah.
These numbers they're heavy lift.
They are, yeah. And I guess the context for these, though, compare to, these are as broad as the old numbers are, so I guess that's the context, and it's distant planning as well. So hopefully this is helpful.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
appreciate the opportunity to come and,
We're looking at anything and everything, short of sending it to outer space, which, but anything else.
Talk about a heavy lift.
Anything else is on our radar screen, and we're
Yeah.
very appreciative that you've done all this work.
yep, yeah, you're welcome.
So, I got, Doug
Sure.
Brown, I got one question if
Selectman
I
Brown.
could. So, what was the thinking in terms of taking the effluent away and abandoning the existing plant rather than just exploring, transporting from our untreated areas?
That was, so the only reason it was in the report, I'm trying to get back to that table again. Almost there, sorry. Was the study basis column is, the center lane is what we did all the costing based on, and that was the likely alternative. We asked each town to consider what the outer bounds of that might be, and given that each facility requires significant investment every 20 to 25 years, that was the left field approach to that. So, I mean, this study doesn't say you should do that. It just says, if in fact there was some point in the long term where you might ask for a really big flow number, what might that be?
And so in the interim, if we wanted to maybe access for just our new areas and keep our plant in place, there was nothing preventing us from doing that. This is just a long-range view, correct?
Correct. What we did carry forward and what was requested for the analysis, for this analysis, was to keep the facility that you have, continue to dispose of effluent in the manner that you do for the collection area that you have, and then for additional sewerage that you would need to collect for whatever purposes, whether it's business, economic development, or for nitrogen abatement, that portion of the flow would go north unless you can find something else in town.
And could you tell me again, what was the existing excess capacity that they have there now?
At Joint Base, it's about 220,000 gallons a day on an annual average basis.
Not very much.
Not much, no. I think that's a fairly common misconception that there's a lot of capacity there. There's a lot of acres there, but there's not a lot of capacity there.
There was in the 40s, but there isn't now.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, again, thank you. This man has to go all the way back to Maine, so we won't keep him any longer, but we really appreciate you coming.
Yep. Thanks.
Okay, next item that some of you have been waiting for, an ocean outfall option, which John Waterbury has been playing a role in a number of different ways.
So I thought I would start by going a small bit of education for the people at home and talk about the treatment levels that we have at various treatment facilities. So the primary treatment, and I'll be referring to these terms throughout the presentation, and you need to understand what each step is. The steps are all sequential, so that if you have a primary treatment, it's simply the removal of solids by settling. Each of our Title V systems at home are a primary treatment system. We have a septic tank in which the solids settle. Every few years we get it pumped out, and everything else goes out into our leaching field, the organics and the nitrogen. In a secondary treatment plant, not only do we remove the solids by settling, but we remove the soluble organic material by aerobic digestion by a group of microorganisms. And this is sort of the traditional level of treatment that one finds at many sewage treatment plants. And then there is tertiary or advanced, and I'll use those two terms interchangeably, treatment, where after primary and secondary treatment, you then remove inorganics, typically nitrogen, but also sometimes phosphorus. The nitrogen removal is done by a series of bacteria with the result that nitrogen end product is N2 gas that goes off into the atmosphere, which is how we get it out of the treatment stream. And typically that process can get about 90% removal with just the microbial processes. Phosphorus can either be treated microbiologically or chemically. We traditionally here have not worried about phosphorus yet. So the question which I'm posing is, why should we consider an ocean outfall on Falmouth? Is that something that's reasonable for us to think about? Eric sort of started this discussion, and the reason I put this map up, because it shows you we have 15 coastal embayments that are variously impacted by nitrogen. The 75% of that nitrogen which is impacting us comes from septic systems. And if you just look at our West Falmouth treatment plant, which is sitting right where it says West Falmouth Harbor, when we built that plant in 1985, it was a secondary treatment plant, so that it did not remove any of the nitrogen. It ran for 20 years with no nitrogen removal. And the result of that was, and we had a series of infiltration beds at the plant, plus spray irrigation, the plume that was generated by that went west and impacted negatively our West Falmouth Harbor fairly significantly. In 2005, we upgraded that plant to a tertiary plant that makes 3 milligrams per liter nitrogen, so it's about 90% removal. We still haven't seen that plume wash through. And so I would argue that any place we think of putting our discharge upland, away from the water, even when we denitrify to 90%, the 10% ends up impacting our coastal water bodies. And so we really need to think about how can we bypass that upland discharge. And if you think about our West Falmouth treatment plant, we know we have a plant that can treat 1.2 million gallons of water a day. But the state's only letting us discharge 700,000 gallons a day. And that's because they don't want us to negatively impact the coastline with even our 90% removal. So we're really sort of hamstrung on discharge. And it has been the bugaboo for us since we started thinking about how to solve this problem. The real challenge is never going to be treatment. It's going to be how do we figure out how to discharge what we've treated. So this is just a little bit of Falmouth sewer history, and it's sort of instructive. We had an outfall in Woods Hole from 1946 to 1985. It basically discharged untreated sewage into Great Harbor for all of those years. In 1967, the state said, hey, you can't do that anymore. You're going to have to build a secondary treatment plant to mitigate the impacts of that outfall. And so at that point, the sewer commissioners put together a sewer study group. They enlisted the help of the scientists at both the Oceanographic and the MBL. They came to the conclusion that what they would do was build a secondary treatment plant on Fay Road that would treat 4 million gallons of water per day and discharge it at an outfall site at Knobska Point. And the 4 million gallons a day was not only going to treat the Woods Hole problem, but also all of the downtown area in Falmouth. And that went through a number of fairly contentious town meetings, was approved at town meeting, and then the idea was killed at the ballot. So in 1971, we basically were back to start. And we batted things around for a number of years. In 1980, we bought the land in West Falmouth where our current plant is situated. As I said, we built that plant in 1985. And in 2005, we upgraded it to tertiary treatment with a discharge permit at 3 milligrams per liter. So at the same time we were struggling with how to deal with our own problem in town, the state decided that the coastal waters of Massachusetts needed to be protected. And they established the Ocean Sanctuaries Act in 1970. And it included all the coastal waters of Massachusetts, including Cape Cod Bay, Buzzards Bay, Vineyard, and Nantucket Sounds. And as part of that act, outfalls were prohibited except by variance. And in all those years, they never granted a single variance. So once the Ocean Sanctuaries Act went into effect in 1970, there were no more outfalls permitted except for Boston, and I'll chat about that in a minute. So the question that early on a number of us thought about was, could a scientific case be made for outfalls with advanced treatment? In other words, if instead of the Ocean Sanctuaries Act assumed that outfalls would only be treated to the secondary level, in other words, nitrogen wouldn't be removed. What would happen if we had outfalls that in fact were tertiary treated? Could we make a case scientifically that the impacts to the receiving waters and to the aquifers from which they were drawn, could we make that case? And so in 2012, in collaboration with the Buzzards Bay Coalition, we held a workshop in New Bedford to explore the feasibility of ocean outfalls within the Massachusetts ocean sanctuaries. And this is a group of the people the interested parties that we've invited to participate in that. And in addition, we invited a number of scientists from the Marine Biological Lab, from the Oceanographic, from the United States Geological Survey, from the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, Cape Cod Commission. And during that day-long workshop, those scientists, we held discussion groups. And at the end of it, there was stakeholder support and scientific consensus that a strong case could be made for outfalls following advanced treatment. Oh, I missed the slide. So the next steps were, once we'd made that, what we thought was a reasonable case for that, we then had a series of meetings, 2 meetings with, up in the State House with the stakeholders and also the upper echelons of the Mass Coastal Zone Management Group and the Department of Environmental Protection. And following those meetings, we decided that a case could successfully be made to modify the Sanctuaries Act to allow outfalls with advanced treatment. Corin Peterson, the head attorney at the Buzzards Bay Coalition, was basically charged with drafting the language to amend the act. And the Ocean Sanctuaries Act was in fact amended by Chapter 259 of the Acts of 2014, allowing outfalls now with advanced treatment. So we now have gotten to a stage where outfalls are not outlawed. We can begin to consider them. So part of that modified Ocean Sanctuaries Act had 4 primary things that an applicant, a municipal applicant, would have to do to be considered for an outfall. One of them, the first, would you'd have to have a completed comprehensive wastewater management permit. The second thing that an applicant would have to do is have 24 months of baseline nutrient water column monitoring and a habitat evaluation of the receiving waters. And then the 2 final things are detailed modeling of the receiving waters to demonstrate that an outfall of the concentration and volume that you were proposing wouldn't negatively impact the receiving waters. And so there have been a series of very sophisticated 3D models which were developed by groups at the Oceanographic and at UMass Dartmouth that were used to evaluate what the impacts would be of the Boston outfall before it was built. And they turned out to be very sophisticated models and were very predictive. And they look at things like water column chemistry, bottom topology, currents, tidal, wind-driven mixing, and they end up giving you a really neat predictive model about what an outfall is going to look like if you put it into your receiving waters. And typically the criterion that's used is one from EPA, which is you map the 1 to 1,000 dilution of an outfall, which is what EPA considers the area that will be impacted by shellfish. So if you have an outfall of X million gallons per day at a certain concentration, you use those models to predict how much of an area within your receiving waters are going to be impacted at the point where you've diluted that effluent to a 1,000-fold. So once you've done that, the 4th criterion that a municipality would have to show is that their aquifer, you would be able to take the water that you were proposing to put in an outfall and would have to demonstrate that the recharge characteristics of the aquifer that the municipality existed in would not be negatively impacted by the discharge of that amount of fresh water. And so to look at a hypothetical, I'm going to use the Boston outfall as an example to compare to what hypothetically we might consider in Falmouth. So the Boston outfall went into service in 2000. It discharges 350 million gallons a day of secondary treated water. It's not advanced treated water. And that results in 12,000 tons of bioavailable nitrogen put into Cape Cod Bay every year. So if theoretically we were to think about a 2 million gallon outfall for our receiving waters in Falmouth that was treated to tertiary treatment level, which is what our West Falmouth plant does, and with a discharge concentration of 3 milligrams per liter, that would result in a nitrogen input to our receiving waters of 9 tons per year. Think about the difference between 12,000 tons per year and 9 tons per year. So it turns out that the Boston outfall has been monitored for many years before it was actually built. The outfall is actually up at the top of the map. It's a little red line that you see there. Those are all the stations which have been monitored for 17 years since that outfall has been turned on. And I just put in a few of the key reports, references, if people want to go and look online. But the bottom line is that 12,000 tons of nitrogen, which they have put into that bay annually, have not been able to find an ecological impact of that. In other words, every year they've put 12,000 tons of bioavailable nitrogen into Cape Cod Bay. They can see no negative impacts of it. So if we're thinking about an outfall of 2 million gallons per day at 9 tons per year, I think you won't be able to find it. And we'll chat about that a little bit more in a minute. So I think, at this point, I think you can make a pretty good case that we could do a 2 million gallon per day outfall in Falmouth without impacting our receiving waters to any significant amount. Oh, I see. So the next question is that fourth part. What is the discharge of 2 million gallons a day going to do to our sole source aquifer? And we have a sole source aquifer that's called the Sagamore Lens. It's been modeled extensively by Dennis LeBlanc and his groups at USGS over a number of years. It has the center of our mound is up at base Cape Cod. It mounds at about 60 feet. Water moves from the top of the mound to the coast at about a foot per day. And I've done a calculation, basically this, for us to see how much fresh water that is. The land area of Falmouth is 44.2 square miles. The rain recharge is calculated by USGS at about 21 inches per year, and that's a very conservative number. It's probably closer to 24 or 25, and that's after evaporation. So that's what's actually getting into the groundwater. And that means that for every square mile of Falmouth, every day we discharge about 1 million gallons of water from just going through the groundwater. So if you calculate then the area of town, every day our share of the aquifer is discharging 44 million gallons a day. And that's going into our coastal ponds, into our streams, and just being discharged at the coast. And so I think it's fair to think that if we're then discharging 2 million gallons per day of that 44 million, that we're really going to have a minimal impact on our sole source aquifer, and probably will have no danger of saltwater intrusion from that. And I think for people at home, that's even brought home more clearly if you think about our Coonamessett River. In March, it discharges 9 million gallons a day. In June, 6 million gallons a day. So if you think about that in reference to a 2 million gallon a day outfall, I think one can feel fairly comfortable that our aquifer can handle that. The other thing that I thought is instructive to think about, and if you think about our aquifer, by far the greatest impact that we have on it is the withdrawal of water for our drinking water and moving it all over the aquifer. So there are the wells in the Sagamore Lens around us. And if you look at our water usage, during the winter, we use about 2.5 million gallons a day we withdraw from the ground. In the summer, it's about 8.5 million gallons a day. Peak days in July and August can get to 11 million gallons a day. And then there are our sources. For instance, our new treatment plant will treat 8 million gallons a day that we've just started. And I think if you think about us withdrawing that amount of water from the aquifer, moving it all over town, when you then think about a 2 million gallon a day outfall, that pales by comparison to what we do to the aquifer to provide ourselves with drinking water. So that's the finish of the slides I had. I did want to just mention that no one has yet made a formal application for an outfall. But the towns of Wareham, Buzzards Bay, and the Mass Maritime Academy have begun to think about a 10 million gallon a day outfall at the Maritime Academy in Bourne. And the reason that that's being done in a project that the Coalition for Buzzards Bay is helping with. The wastewater treatment plant in Wareham is on the Agawam River, and it's a tertiary treatment plant. It discharges at 3 milligrams per liter into the Agawam River. But that discharge, again, like our West Falmouth discharge, is enough to degrade the Agawam River significantly. So, and at the moment, the Maritime Academy has a little outfall of fairly untreated water going into the canal. And the plan is to pick up Main Street in Buzzards Bay, the Maritime Academy, take them back to the treatment plant in Wareham, treat it to 3 milligrams per liter, and then bring everything back and discharge it at the Maritime Academy at 10 million gallons per day. And they have taken the step of modeling. They've done those receiving water models using that very sophisticated set of models to analyze that. And it turns out that the area of that 1 to 1,000 dilution that EPA is interested in is on the west side of the canal, right by the Maritime Academy. It is 45 meters wide and 300 meters long, 0.13 acres. And when they look at all the embayments at the northern end of Buzzards Bay, they can see virtually no impact of that nutrient input. Now, the canal's a pretty special place. Every tidal cycle, 20 billion gallons of water go through that canal. But I think it still shows us an example of, they're talking about a 10 million gallon a day outfall. And virtually the models show you won't be able to see a thing. So I think this is a real option, and I believe it will ultimately be the solution to our discharge problem.
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
For all your work, for all these years. You have taken something that was impossible when you first looked at it and made it possible. And that's enormous. And that never happens. So, questions from the committee, then questions from the...
John, is the following reasoning also support your claim? That there's already 14 outfalls, normally called estuaries, that are dumping the nitrogen into the Sound and Buzzards Bay. If you sewer any one of those areas and tertiary treat it, you take that nitrogen, send it off as nitrogen gas, and so the net into your outer water body is actually less than what was there before.
So that's true. And so in that 44 million gallons of groundwater that we let go into our marine environment contains all the septage that we have in groundwater. If we can take a portion of that and treat it to remove 90% of the nitrogen, and then we put it out in the receiving waters, there's a net gain to that. In other words, the receiving waters are not seeing the same impact if we just let them go through the groundwater.
Absolutely. Any other Comments, questions?
I mean, yeah, just to add to that, right now, the estuaries are the treatment plant.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, right,
And
right.
the effects are not good.
Sam Patterson. John, do you have any idea of what fraction of that 8.5 million gallon average freshwater consumption in Falmouth is actually evaporated in terms of irrigation so that it actually doesn't recharge the aquifer?
Well, our annual, I can't remember the numbers from USGS, but we get, what, 36 inches of rain a year, something like that?
Yeah.
And the recharge is something like 23 or 24. I use 21. So basically, half of what we get is rainwater evaporates, and the other half goes to recharge the aquifer.
He's talking about domestic water.
I'm
Goes
talking
through the
about-
town's pipes and gets to people's
It would
houses.
only
Exactly
be
right.
the stuff that you spray on your lawn. If you
Yeah.
flush it down the
I don't
toilet or
know,
down
and
the
I have
sink, it's
no
not
idea what-
evaporating.
Yeah.
I understand that. And so what I'm really
Does he
asking
have
is
the number?
what fraction
Yeah.
is actually being used for irrigation, which is spraying out onto people's lawns, and very little of which actually gets down into the aquifer?
Well, only half of which, let's say, would
Okay,
get down
fine.
there. I don't know those numbers, but I think what we're seeing there is we're a town of 30,000 people in the winter and 100 and some thousand in the summer. And the difference between the 2.5 and the 8.5 is the fact that we have a huge population increase during the summer season. And that's where the enormous value comes from our Long Pond Reservoir, is it allows us a buffer that lets us meet peak demand in the summer. If we were just relying on wells, we'd be in deep trouble.
Yeah, I understand that. And what I was kind of projecting was if at some point in the future, saltwater intrusion were an issue because of an offshore discharge, we could actually tell people you can't irrigate anymore and offset that to some extent by just simply eliminating irrigation of lawns, for instance, as a way of, minimizing the bypassing, if you will, of what we would normally put in the ground. That's the only thing I was trying to do is come.
I think one of the things we need to think about, the Sagamore lens is an incredible aquifer. And the fact that we have a big base in it where we're not putting half-acre house lots is a huge benefit to us. And I don't believe that we will ever have a problem of drawing down so much on the aquifer that by exporting 2 million gallons through an outfall, that we would ever have to worry about saltwater intrusion.
Thanks.
You may get an answer to that question fairly soon, because there's a bunch of people in the Heights who have figured out that their sewer bill is based on their total water usage, and they are going to find ways of removing the lawn watering and the car washing component of that from their water bill. Whether they do it by installing a well in the backyard or putting in 2 meters, they will find a way to, and you'll get some examples of how much savings there would be.
It's just a different standard of landscaping.
Comments or questions from the planning board? Paul?
My name is Paul Dreyer. I'm the Coastal Resiliency Committee. John, it was a very impressive presentation. You spent a lot of effort on that. But I would like to raise 2 points. One is, one of the more vulnerable areas of the town is along Surf Drive Beach. And as you well know, the sewer line from Woods Hole goes under the bike path. 40 years ago today, we had that major storm. If we lose that bike path and that line, we have a major problem. It's going to take a long time to fix. The other issue is, as pointed out on a number of occasions, the limiting factor of the treatment plant is the discharge. And as we increase density and other things, add more searing areas, we approach the 80% level, we'll have to do something at the treatment plant. If we were to remove a portion, for example, in Woods Hole, and go back to the outfall off Nautica Point, we could probably alleviate that problem as well.
I think the thing you have to remember is you will not get a permit for an outfall unless you have used advanced treatment. The Ocean Sanctuaries Act, as it's amended, will only permit an outfall if the municipality is treating its effluent to advanced treatment, in other words, 3 milligrams per liter.
It would have to be advanced treatment, no question.
So, you know, you've got to take it from Woods Hole, take it back up to the plant, treat it, and take it somewhere. And I think there are long-range plans to deal with that force main going along the bike path from Woods Hole to our West Falmouth treatment plant. It's failed a couple of times. And I believe that the DPW has plans for moving that so that there's a long-range plan that realizes that that's a vulnerability that we're going to have to deal with at some point.
If you could find space in Woods Hole for advanced treatment, then you can discharge the outflow. We'd have to pump it up and save all the electricity.
Well,
and
one of the issues in 1971 was there was a treatment plant to be built on Fay Road. And there are a group of people that live in that area of Falmouth who I don't think would be amenable to us putting another treatment plant there.
But you do have the
If
water
Ron,
tower.
if Ron were here, he would second that motion.
Clearly, there's a lot of issues. I'm just raising two that I thought might want to consider as well.
Right. Further discussion on this? Again, this is an enormously valuable and comprehensive look at a very complicated problem. And my hat's off to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think it really is a real possibility now. There are a few bits and pieces to still be done. And the Coastal Zone Management has not come out with the final set of regulations yet. We've been working through the Coalition for Buzzards Bay. We have written them a white paper suggesting what those permitting requirements might be. They have that now. They haven't responded to it yet. But I think that group in Wareham is going to be pushing the envelope, and I think they may very well be the first group to actually make an application for an outfall in the sanctuary.
And that's very good news. We do not want to be first. It's terrific to have some other town and group put it together and be first. Steve?
John, if these other places all do go first, in worst case, I take it there's enough capacity for everybody in the hydrodynamic models.
Yeah, I mean, just think about the Boston outfall. What we have for 17 years put into Cape Cod Bay. 12,000 tons of bioreactive nitrogen per year, and we can't see any impact of it. So we're talking now about treating to the level of Perrier and putting it in our receiving waters. So I don't think that will be, you know, by being third to make an application to put something in our coastal waters, I don't think we'll be at a disadvantage.
Some people will remember back in the late 90s, there was a movement on Cape Cod called Stop the Outfall Pipe, which a lot of people got very engaged in. And their premise was we had to stop this Boston outfall pipe because it was going to do irreparable harm to Cape Cod Bay. And one of the gains that group made was that they insisted on and obtained an unprecedented level of prior monitoring of this pipe before a drop went through it. There were years of the most intensive scientific evaluation ever. And after the pipe was up and running, as John's pointed out, all this monitoring proved was that it had no effect. And so you can thank Cape Cod for the fact that we know that. Request for up to $700 from Article 17 to help pay for the fertilizer bylaw mailing. Discussion and vote. Every year, the town sends out a letter to everyone who has a piece of property within 100 feet of a coastal estuary telling them they are not allowed to fertilize at all in that 100-foot zone. We need, we have a partnership with the Harbor Master's Office where they sign the letter and they help pay for it, but they don't have a separate appropriation for it, and they need $700 more this year for that mailing to go out. I think in the future, we'll make sure that it's sufficient funds are in their line item so that we don't have to do this. But this year, to send it out, they need $700, and I think we're proposing to take that from Article 17.
Is this a water bill kind of thing? Goes out in the water bill? Or is
No, it goes
totally
out
separate?
just,
mailing.
just to the people who own property within 100 feet of an estuary.
So do we just need a motion from the committee. I'll make that motion, that we make a formal request that that money be set aside.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded to request the selectmen to allocate $700 from Article 17 for the mailing. Discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
We got it? Reports of members and staff? I have a few reports. Virginia would have some of them if she were here. She's not. The Boynes Pond supersede order has been issued, and I looked at it, and I put on it, but it appeared to me they supported the town's position
Yes.
100%.
Yeah, they gave the go-ahead on all 3 points they approved. They said the Conservation Commission acted properly, and they said the benefits of the program made it fit the ecological restoration criteria, and I forget the details.
This is not a total green light. The one neighbor who has been appealing this matter up till now has the right to appeal this decision as well. But it certainly is a great endorsement of
Yes.
the plan as presented by the town meeting and the selectmen and the committee and the conservation commission. So, what else? For the people who've been involved in the IA systems and how to pay for them, and we had a meeting with Kendall Ayers, who's involved with the county 5% loan program. As it turns out, that 5% loan program that they operate, those funds can be lent for installing IAs. And there is nothing magic about the 5%. That was just an add-on that the county wanted to make sure that its costs were covered, but it could easily be done with 0%. So we don't have to invent anything here for the homeowners who need funds to help pay for an IA. The town has a roadmap to have that option available to those folks. Next.
So the betterment could, in principle, be the same percent as for sewers, for instance, effectively, or some different percent.
Yeah, no, it's definitely helpful. We don't have to invent something. It's out there. Shortly, the selectmen will be getting a proposed contract with GHD to do a number of studies that this committee's asked for, as well as to begin work on the CWMP that's due in 2019. That'll be coming up shortly. The legislature is in a mode, shall we say, regarding Airbnb. And the premise here is that it should be taxed because hotels are taxed, motels are taxed, Airbnb people should be taxed. And unlike most taxes, Airbnb and the other people who do this are in favor of the tax. So it's not a hard tax to implement. As the legislature has been moving forward on the idea of implementing such a tax, a good portion of which would go to the state, a good portion of which would go to the towns, there's also been a movement to have a portion of it go to the towns or to a regional entity for funding wastewater capital projects. It's very much in flux as to whether that piece will be in it, how big that piece would be, what the rules of that piece would be. But it's something that is actually moving up there. And whether, in the end, there is something that's good for Falmouth in it, we just have to wait. But at least the Cape's interest in having funding for wastewater capital projects is on the table. and part of the discussion. And, when it's all over, we'll have our state reps and senators come down here and tell us what happened. Right now, they don't know and we don't know. Any other reports of members and staff? We have the minutes of the prior meeting, January 18th. They were sent around. Everybody has seen them. Everyone's had an opportunity to offer amendments. Any amendments?
One minor point in section 2, I think Herman room has 2 ends in it.
I think you're right.
It's right, the
Yeah,
first,
that's it. Going back and forth, I think it's
Okay.
other than that, I will move that they be accepted as presented.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.
So when you get some-
Any further business to come before the committee? If not, a motion from Matt will be gratefully accepted.
Motion to adjourn, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
No, any seconds. All right, all in favor?
All right.
We adjourn.
Good, thank you.